The human brain is the most complex structure in the known universe. And it is this structure which stores our memories, is the seat of our drives, is the seat of the commands which coordinate muscles and glands. And so then obviously it's fascinating how might this structure work? And certainly as we study the effects of strokes, brain injuries, the effects of pharmaceuticals, this is something which is a fascinating source of study. But given that it is the most complex structure in the known universe, obviously this can be a bit daunting. And so the first thing that we are going to do is to break the brain into 6 regions. And then this video is going to comprise the first 3, which collectively we call the brainstem. And so once again, there are
the cerebrum.
There are 6 major regions of the brain. The largest here, the cerebrum, we're going to have to remove in order to see the midbrain. We're also going to remove part of the second largest part of the brain. This is the cerebellum in the occipital region of the skull. And the green region here, the diencephalon, such as this, we're going to remove this large lobe of the thalamus. And so there are 6 major regions of the brain, the largest being the cerebrum here in aqua, the second largest being the cerebellum, the third largest being the diencephalon. This video is going to go over the smallest 3, the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. Okay. Now, before going through these separate regions, just a few things that they share in common. First off, if you look at their color, so if you look at their color in a, let me just go back, in a straight bisection, then you'll notice that many of these regions have a lighter color. So for example, if you look here at the medulla, or at the pons, or at the midbrain, notice that they are largely composed of white matter. You can contrast that to the gray matter around them. All right, and so just as the spinal cord had white matter and gray matter, that the neural tissue is organized. We see the same thing here in the brain. Let me just get the best one. All right. Now, we could actually use a variety of different stains. So in some stains, we could actually, using silver, we could actually make the white matter look black. So here, and sorry, this takes a second to wrap your mind around. You can see the white matter. This has been stained black. So notice once again, there is organization. And the brainstem, notice how black this is. It is largely then composed of then the white matter. And this is because the white matter, if you recall, is white because so many of the axons are wrapped in myelin, whose lipid component gives it a lighter color. So obviously, if you have the body, outside the brain, and then here's the 2 largest parts of the brain, the cerebrum and the cerebellum. If you ask, what is the brainstem doing? What is its role? Well, obviously then to a large extent, it has to have fibers going to and from the body and then the major regions of the brain. And so there are ascending tracts which have to pass through the brainstem, which reach the cerebellum and the cerebrum, the 2 largest parts of the brain. There are then descending tracts coming from the cerebrum and cerebellum that have to pass through the brainstem in order to reach the body. So that is why when we looked at the brainstem, it was whiter in color. It is primarily white matter because of all of these ascending and descending tracts carrying information between the body and the 2 largest parts of the brain. But there is also gray matter in the brainstem, forming a number of nuclei. There are nuclei in the medulla, there are nuclei in the pons, there are nuclei in the midbrain, all of which are involuntary. So there are soma there which are making decisions about muscle movements, about glandular secretions, but then all of these decisions then are involuntary decisions. Now, if you look then I'll consider the medulla, the pons, and the reticular formation separately, but let's look at them collectively for right now. There is gray matter associated with the ascending pathways that sort out sensory stimuli, determining where to focus our attention, determining arousal and attention, how alert we are, regulating sleeping and dreaming. And so these gray nuclei do those tasks. There are also then nuclei associated with descending pathways, which will then cause involuntary reflexes, resulting in movement of the head and body, working on breathing, blood pressure, heart rate. There are pain pathways, and then there are autonomic pathways as well. And so the reticular formation, we'll start off with a primitive fish, but if you consider the medulla, the midbrain, and then even the thalamus to some degree, the pons appears in mammals, notice that there are nuclei spread throughout these structures, which are important in many involuntary functions. They advanced a bit as we go, from sharks into mammals, etc. But the point is we can refer to them collectively as the reticular formation. So we could say, this nucleus in the midbrain does this, this nucleus in the medulla does this, or it's also then just to once again speak of them collectively as the diffuse gray matter throughout the brainstem. Now, if you recall, through the spinal cord, there was a descending tract, then known as the reticulospinal tract, coming from the reticular formation, then going to the spinal cord, and it was responsible for involuntary movements of the of skeletal muscles. So there would be an example where instead of treating this nucleus in the medulla separately from that one in the midbrain, then the answer is then simply to have a reticulospinal tract dealing with the diffuse areas of gray matter throughout the brainstem collectively. Okay, so that being said, now let's look at the medulla and the pons, and then finally the midbrain. So the medulla is the region of the brain just inside the foramen magnum. So the spinal cord enters the cranium through the foramen magnum, and it expands to form the medulla, this first region of the brain. Once again, the medulla is primarily white matter when we look at it, because there are ascending pathways and descending pathways. Very importantly, the corticospinal tract, which is giving us voluntary control, has to obviously go from the cortex down to the spinal cord. So it's passing through the medulla. And we will actually see these triangular ridges known as pyramids on the ventral surface of the medulla, where these tracts are traveling, and that's why the voluntary control over muscle in a future video will be called the pyramidal system, because its fibers are traveling through the pyramids, these triangularly shaped ridges throughout the midbrain. Throughout the medulla. The sensory neurons coming up through the posterior column for touch. Some are coming through the vesiculus cuneatus, some are coming through the vesiculus gracilis. They then synapse in the medulla in a nucleus gracilis and a nucleus cuneatus before then the next neurons continue on to carry touch information further. But in any case, so those were examples of descending motor tracts coming through the medulla and ascending sensory tracts going through the medulla. Now, the medulla, while being mostly white matter, nevertheless does have very important regions of soma. So it is here that we have the major cardiovascular center, determining heart rate, blood pressure, and then also determining where blood goes in your body. So for example, if you look at your blood vessels, they have muscle in their wall in what's called the tunica median. And you have 5 liters of blood in your body, but you have 8 liters of space. So in other words, you don't have enough blood to fill all your blood vessels. You are constantly deciding, do I need to send blood more over here or more over here? This part of my body gets more blood during exercise. This part of my body gets more blood when I'm at rest, digesting my food, etc. And so the medulla has the major cardiovascular center, which is, is governing what should my heart rate be, what should my blood pressure be, where should blood be going in my body. Now, I know this sounds odd for some of us because some of us think that our brain is what we are consciously aware of, but all of the brainstem is involuntary. So you are aware of your heart rate, your blood pressure, and where blood is going in your body, and you can make decisions which modify that. Now, none of this is voluntary, and so you're not aware of it, but that doesn't mean you're not doing it. In the same way, we have respiratory centers, which are, measuring how much do I need to be breathing. Is acid building up in my body, say lactic acid after exercise? Should I be breathing more? And so we have rhythmicity centers, which governs the pace of breathing, and then specifically sends commands to the muscles of inhaling and muscles of exhaling. There are a number of cranial nerves, which I'll discuss later, but a number of them originate in the medulla. So the medulla is a very important part of the brain. Obviously, if you're regulating, heart rate and breathing, that's important. The medulla also regulates other things such as swallowing, coughing, hiccuping, vomiting. So there are lots of decisions made here which are involuntary. And once again, those cranial nerves, some of which originate in the medulla, so that then is important. If ever one were to get struck in the back of the head or develop inflammation, say in meningitis, that's a problem because the medulla is so important. Damage to the back of the head, would be a real problem. If pressure built up because of, say, the accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid, which then pushed the medulla through the foramen magnum, that could cause brain damage, which could then affect your ability to wake up after a coma or govern heart rate, etc. And so the medulla is this first region in red, certainly very important in brain function. The next region I'd like to discuss is the pons, and it's prominent here as this this bulge. Now let me just kind of exit this for a while. If you were to look at brains of simpler animals than humans, they don't have a pons, all right? So you wouldn't say, here's the pons in a reptile, here's a pons of, a fish. While they have some of the same neurons, it's not an obvious discrete section of the brain. If you look at an opossum's brain, you say, oh, here's a little bulge of a pons. If you look at, say, a cat's brain, you can see a bit of a pons. If you look at a sheep's brain, you can look at a bit of a pons. But then when you look at humans, that's a huge prominent region of the brain. So what happened in mammals that they developed a pons, and then specifically in primates, apes, and especially then humans, that this pons then becomes so prominent. Well, one of the major things is, and I'll get to this when I talk about the cerebellar peduncles, if you notice the position of the pons, it is in between the cerebellum and the cerebrum, so kind of right smack in the middle. And so a lot of the axons, which are coming up from the body and then have to turn into the cerebellum, or going from the cerebellum and then have to turn and go to the cerebrum, or coming from the cerebrum and then turn to go to the cerebellum. Obviously, the body is communicating with these two largest parts of the brain, but they are also communicating with each other. So the cerebrum and cerebellum have to be sending fibers back and forth. Well, in mammals, these brain regions got bigger. In primates, they got bigger. In apes, bigger. And then in humans, even bigger. And so just as if you have two cities that gets bigger, the roads between them have to get wider because there's more traffic. Then as these two brain regions underwent such expansion in mammals, primates, humans, then this region of the brain became more prominent. So it got recognized as its own separate region, and then in humans it's so much bigger, the pons. And once again, among the structures here are structures going back and forth, since it's at the base of the cerebellum, the second largest part of the brain, going to the cerebellum or between the cerebellum and cerebrum. Now, while it is primarily white matter, once again with these axons, there are breathing centers here, not as important as those of the medulla, but nevertheless, perhaps governing the transition between inhale and exhale, and limiting in our inhales so that they're not too, limiting them so that they're not excessive. And then there are also then nuclei of the cranial nerves, which we'll discuss later, coming from here. So the pons is an important part of the brain. The midbrain is the last part of the brainstem, but I have a couple of videos on it, which will then bring a number of things together. So let me go through this quick video first. Obviously, there are fiber tracts going through the midbrain, both descending tracts, so the corticospinal tract carrying voluntary muscle commands passes through these cerebral peduncles before becoming the pyramids of the medulla. And then the touch fibers coming from that nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus of the medulla will then form the medial lemniscus, carrying the message onward. So here you can see that there are messages of descending tracts and messages of ascending tracts. On the dorsal surface of the midbrain, we can see these two prominent bumps. So this whole region we could call the tectum, or the corpora quadrigemina, because there's two pairs of bumps, so quadriform. Or we could refer to the first pair of bumps as the superior colliculi, where vision is processed, or the inferior colliculi, beneath that, where hearing is processed. Now, one of the areas is called the substantia nigra, because dopamine is made there, and melanin, which obviously has a dark pigment, is one of the precursors to dopamine. So these areas have a darker structure. And then there's also an area known as the red nucleus because of the iron which is there. So that was a kind of a quick overview, now a little bit more in depth. The embryonic brain starts as a prosencephalon, which will then make the cerebrum and the diencephalon. The rhombencephalon, which will form the medulla, the cerebellum, and the pons, and then the mesencephalon, which forms the midbrain. So notice that the midbrain is the only region which is the sole structure coming from one of those three embryonic regions. Now, in mammals, the cerebrum and cerebellum take on far greater roles, so the midbrain is reduced. In other animals, the midbrain is a bit more prominent. It's easiest to find by that tectum region, which once again could form 4 separate structures, a pair of superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. Also important, as I'll mention later in identifying structures in the midbrain, is that cerebrospinal fluid in the brain flows through ventricles, starting off with lateral ventricles, then a third ventricle, and then there is what's known as the cerebral aqueduct passing through the midbrain before getting to the 4th ventricles. And so here's the lateral ventricles, the 3rd ventricle, and then from the 3rd ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid would then pass through the cerebral aqueduct, which was there in aqua, which goes through then the midbrain. So the midbrain has this tube through which cerebrospinal fluid passes. And this also, once again, if you were identifying structures in the midbrain, here are those colliculi of a sheep's brain, the superior colliculi, the inferior colliculi. And here is then that cerebral aqueduct where the cerebrospinal fluid will pass. From there, the cerebrospinal fluid can go into the 4th ventricle or the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay. So with those references, let's then look at the midbrain. And here's a section of the midbrain. And so you can see this cerebral aqueduct. And then there can be gray matter around it, known as the periaqueductal gray matter. So there is this space for cerebrospinal fluid, and then gray matter around it. Dorsal to this is what we call the tectum, which can be divided once again into the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi, and then there's a little more of the tectum than those, other than those bumps. So that is what is dorsal to the cerebral aqueduct, those superior and inferior colliculi. And when we look at a section of the brain like this, how the section is made. So at one level, you would see the superior colliculi, and at another level, you would see the inferior colliculi. And if you were in the isthmus region, then you wouldn't see the colliculi at all. So as we go down the brain, what type of transverse section we make at what level determines which nuclei we will see. So we have a cerebral aqueduct, the tectum with the colliculi, and then we have an area called the tegmentum that has is then attached to the cerebral peduncles. This is the, quote, stalk of the cerebrum, what it literally means. And then the leg of the cerebrum would then be this, this final part. And so there's a lot going on here, as you can see. So there's, white matter. Once again, in these images, the white matter has stained black. So lots of fibers like the corticospinal tract, which is transmitting voluntary commands to skeletal muscle. But then there are other tracts as well. So this is all white matter, which goes through the the midbrain. And so notice that these are going down, whether it be corticospinal from the cortex to the spinal cord, or frontopontine fibers, once again, going from the cerebrum to the pons. But then there can be ascending tracts as well, such as the spinothalamic tract. Its name tells you that it's going up here. In addition, there are nuclei of some of the cranial nerves, such as the ocular motor nerve, which moves the eye, or one of the multiple nuclei of the large trigeminal nerve comes from the midbrain. So there is white matter. Those nuclei are gray matter, as is the red nucleus and the substantia nigra. And so the midbrain is the smallest section of the brain, but certainly a lot is going on there. And I pursue this in a little more depth. I have a video on the nuclei of the midbrain and one on the fibers. I'd like to just kind of summarize it. So one statement I make a lot to students, if we were to say about the nuclei of the midbrain, who cares, all right? Because I'm not, aware of them. It's easy then to think that they don't matter. And so the example that I give is, let's say, for example, that I had a stroke or a head injury, and as a result, I could not move my facial muscles on one side. And if someone said smile for the camera, I would do this. All right, I couldn't move this side. I was like, no, smile for the camera. I would do this. All right, but if someone told me a joke, it is possible, depending on where the injury was, that I could then laugh using both sides of my facial muscles. And someone would say, oh, like you move your facial muscles, like do it again. And then I would do this. And the difference then is that there is involuntary control and voluntary control. We are aware of the voluntary, but that doesn't mean that the involuntary isn't happening. And so there's a lot we do with our eyes that we aren't aware of. We track things with our eyes as reflexes. Even if the part of my brain, which is voluntarily, or that I'm consciously aware of processing visual information, even if my occipital lobe was damaged, I still might be able to blink when something is getting close to my face. And someone would say, oh, you say you can't see with one eye closed because of that stroke you had in your occipital lobe, but you blinked. So obviously you saw it coming towards you. And the answer is, once again, there are different parts of the brain. Some are performing voluntary conscious processing, while others are producing involuntary processing. We are often unaware of the involuntary, but that doesn't mean it's not happening, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's not important. So there are inferior colliculi, the inferior pair of bumps. These are processing a number of auditory reflexes. So in addition to your conscious analysis of what you hear, you also have involuntary processing of what you hear. And then there's superior colliculi at a different level, which are processing visual information. The substantia nigra that you saw, this is where we send a lot of involuntary commands to muscle cells. And so depending on where you cut the brain, you would see superior colliculi of the midbrain where visual reflexes and information are processed, the inferior colliculi where auditory information is processed, the substantia nigra, which gives so many involuntary commands to muscle. And this is important when we talk of, say, Parkinson's disease, because the dysregulation of the neurons in the substantia nigra, this then would result in the tremors. So in addition to voluntary commands, I can reach out and grab something that was a voluntary command. But if I'm doing this while I reach, right, it's not a problem with my voluntary center. See, I'm reaching. That was my voluntary decision. It's the tremors, the involuntary problems there. And so dysregulation in the substantia nigra of the midbrain can result in some of those muscular disorders. So moving onward, once again, the reason that some people are studying anatomy is to treat patients, some of which who may have strokes or injuries which affect different regions of the brain. And so the idea of the organization of the brain, we have different regions of the brain. Those regions have both gray and white matter that are performing different functions. That's how we kind of approach this. And obviously one part of the brain affects the other. So one of the things I end with here is the midbrain makes a lot of neurotransmitters called catecholamines, the dopamine and serotonin. But then from the midbrain, there are neurons, which then project to other regions. And so what's known as the RAF nuclei, they make serotonin, and they project through various parts of the brain. So here you can see a human brain, and this is the midbrain region. This would be where that cerebral aqueduct is. And here you can see those two pairs of bumps, or well, just one of the two pairs, the other one be on the other lateral side, the superior colliculus, which processes vision, and the inferior colliculus, which processes hearing. The last point I would just like to make, so sometimes instead of referring to the medulla, pons, and midbrain separately, we just bunch them together and call them the brainstem. And another thing that they share is, if you look here at the cerebellum of the sheep here, this is the second largest part of the brain. It is then fixed onto the brain stem. So this means that both structurally it has to be attached, but then also there have to be lots of axons of white matter going back and forth between the cerebellum, which is here, and say the pons, which is here. So see all this gray matter, this white matter, which is both attaching it and then also providing, impulses to go back and forth. So there are three then of these stalks called peduncles, which attach the cerebellum. And so the cerebellum is attached. So physically that's important, but then also, obviously, you need the fibers to communicate back and forth. So the midbrain has the superior cerebellar peduncles. They are just inferior to the inferior colliculi. So they're superior colliculi, inferior colliculi, and then the superior cerebellar peduncles are there. Then the pons has the middle cerebellar peduncles, and you can also then see that nicely in the lateral view. And then in the medulla, there are the inferior cerebellar peduncles. So these three, and so they help to make up some of the lateral border of the fourth ventricle there. And so they are important structurally, but then also you could then ask, if you were so inclined, what types of fibers are going through the superior cerebellar peduncles, the inferior cerebellar peduncles, etc. Okay, and so then with the discussion of the brainstem, the cerebellum will be discussed later. And then one final point then was that here in each of the three regions of the brainstem, there are these cerebellar peduncles on which help to fix and communicate with the cerebellum. So this has been an overview of the three smallest parts of the brain, collectively called the brainstem.